Hello, hello, and welcome to Teacher's Hacks Lab. I am Tammy, the OWL teacher, and I'm going to get you started today on how to manage small groups. My objectives for you today is to discuss how to group students, how to come up with some great activities for these groups, preparation ahead of time for the groups, managing behavior in groups, things to consider when there are behavior problems, and then what to do when there are, and then how to organize your groups, and then how to establish accountability. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is how you want to group your students. There's two different ways that you can group them. The first way is homogeneous, or what is now popularly termed as flexible. This is where students are grouped according to their ability levels. It is based off of an assessment or an observation. You determine whether the students all understand a certain concept, and then you put them together so you can teach them that concept. The other type is called heterogeneous, or now commonly called mixed levels. And that is where you have some students who are on a high level, some who are on a mid-level, and some who are on a low level that are all put together. When you have students who are in a homogeneous group or a heterogeneous group, these groups change throughout the year. These are not their set groups from beginning to end. Some things that you want to consider is when you do form groups, you want to make sure that the group sizes are small. You want to make sure that if it's an intensive support group, you have approximately 4 to 5 students and about 5 to 6 students total, regardless of whether it's intensive support or not. You don't want to go above 6 students because it makes it very difficult for students to get the kind of attention that they need. You want to consider the dynamics of the students as you're placing them in groups. So for instance, you want to think about their behavior, their attitudes, and even their work ethics when you're forming the groups together. Oftentimes, I will try to balance out the groups by thinking about who is my shy students and who are my talkative students. And I tend to put like one shy student in the group, and then I try to go to the other end of the spectrum and put a talkative student in the group. That way it kind of balances it out. And then you want to make sure that you're monitoring the progress of the students frequently to help make changes as needed. And when I say monitor the progress of the group, you want to consider all areas of progress. You're thinking about the progress of the group getting along as far as socially, because there could be a possibility that students butt heads. So then you may need to switch students out into other groups. There's also the possibility that students are showing growth and they need to move up into a different ability group, or that students don't have the foundational skills as you thought and they need to move to a lower ability group. So what do you do when students are not meeting with you? If you don't have a plan for the students who are not meeting with you, if you're just having them work at their desk and doing independent work, they're going to often end up wandering around the room, talking to their friends, not knowing what to do, and that can often lead to behavioral problems and consequently causing you to not be able to do any small group work. Unfortunately, that is a common problem with group work and even with centers. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to decide if you want to have the students work at their seat or work in centers. If you have the students work at their seats, you want to make sure that you are providing them with enough work that they will be able to work the whole entire time, not wander around the room or talk to their friends. If you're putting the students in centers, you want to make sure that you have enough work for them to do the whole entire time. Such examples of centers, or even at their seat, would be computer work, writing, science, listening. They could listen to a book on the computer or even a CD. You can have them work on games or social studies activities, current events activities, working with manipulatives or book club or novel study. You could have them do poetry or drama. even buddy readings, or even journal writing. Regardless of whether they're at their seat or in the centers, they must be able to complete the work independently. It's extremely important that they're doing it independently. If it's a mixed ability group, you can consider doing peer tutoring with higher skill abilities. You would have the higher skill students work with the mid-skilled students, and the mid-skills working with the lower skilled. You do not want to have a high-skilled student working with a low-skilled student. If you do that, you're taking the risk that the high-skilled student will become extremely frustrated with the low-skilled. If you keep the students in close range, high to mid and mid to low, then you are also making it easier for their self-esteem to not feel embarrassed by the greater difference between the students. You also want to consider using activities that reinforce or review things that you've already taught in the classroom. That way students can continue to work on it independently and they know what they're doing. When you do the planning for the centers and the activities, you want to make sure that you plan with the learning objective in mind, not the product. Many times I have found that teachers will begin by thinking, what can I have them make, or what can I have them do in particular, rather than thinking about what standard can I have them address. So you want to make sure that you're thinking about what standard they are going to address, and think about what you're working on in whatever subject area it is focused on. It must be relevant and it must be valuable to the student. Otherwise, again, they will be off task. Make sure that you're considering time as a major factor in creating the groups, because if you're meeting in the center and they only have that center or group for 10 to 15 minutes and you are providing them with an activity that takes 20 minutes to do, the activity then could potentially be lost or not completed. And then lastly, determine what students will do when they complete the work. So if they do finish early, do you want them to turn it in, or do you want them to put it in their desk? Do you want them to put it in a folder? What would you like them to do? What if they don't finish early? What would you like them to do? So you want to keep in mind these little factors, and also determine, do you want the student to return to their seat when they finish or start a new activity? So now we're going to talk about activities that students do when they are meeting with you. The first thing you want to do is you want to consider the learning objective. Very much so, just like when you are talking about the students working independently, you're going to consider the learning objective when they're meeting with you. Since your groups that are meeting with you are either mixed ability or most likely they're going to be flexible, so they're going to be all on the same ability, you're going to decide if you want to do a reinforcement activity, a reteach activity, a new skill or concept, or even an enrichment activity. You definitely don't want the student sitting there waiting while you work one-on-one with another student in the group. You want to plan with the learning objective in mind, not the product, so exactly like the other groups. Again, it must be relevant and it must be valuable. Consider time as a factor, and then determine how you will take notes for your observations. Because when you meet in groups, this is your opportunity to assess, even if it's informally, so that you can relate this information for your child study meetings and also to parents during parent-teacher conferences. When we think about what we're doing ahead of time, you need to decide if you'll have your students rotate from center to center, or if you're only going to have them do one center a day, or if they're only meeting with you and then working at their desk. You will need to decide how often they will rotate and what they will do in their next group. You will need to also decide how they will transition. For an example, they may want to transition when the timer goes off, or when you ring a bell, or when you even say rotate. You will also need to decide your expectations of when students are in groups, whether they're working with you or not. So here are two posters for an example, both basically saying the same thing of posted expectations. You'll also want to give expectations of getting materials that they need when they're in groups, expectations for completing the work or when they're done with the work, expectations for what to do when they need help, expectations for transitions, and then the expectations for, of course, their behavior and their voice levels. Now you have to decide how you're going to hold students accountable. Will you collect the work? Will you place a check in the box on a sheet with their names, stating that they actually were working the whole entire time so they can get a participation grade? Do you have students complete work logs? You will need to decide how you want to determine that students are actually on task the whole entire time. Use roles. You can use roles as an option, such as one student be the timekeeper, so they know how much longer they have before they rotate, and another student be the on-task or task manager to make sure that all students are on task. The task manager can then report to you on which students were not on task and which ones were. Another option would be to use a rubric for participation and behavior during the group time. When you start thinking about managing the groups and focusing on the behavior, the first thing you're going to want to do is model and practice and review the appropriate procedures. So you're going to want to make sure that students know what to do when something doesn't work, when they don't understand the activity at the center, when they finish early, whom to go to for help, how to clean up the center, and then how to decide who goes first. You will also want to make sure that students model, practice, and review transitions. So they will need to know the signal on when to change, when to clean up, and then make sure that you have consistency with all of those techniques. So if you're always using a timer to signal a transition, you will want to make sure that that is something you do every time. Make sure that you discuss the expected behavior and consequences, reviewing the rules and expectations when in the centers and when transitioning. Make sure the consequences are meaningful, match the rules, and are consistent. Review and model the expected behaviors continuously, just as you would do at the beginning of the school year. If you aren't doing these, you will consistently have students asking you for help and bothering you while you're in small groups. Things to consider when you have behavior problems are these few questions. While it's not always the teacher's problem or the teacher's job, it's not always a reflection on the teacher. These are some things you may want to consider before moving on to other issues. First thing you want to consider is, did I do an effective job teaching the activity? Sometimes we need to go back through and make sure that students definitely understand the activity before we can consider that they just don't understand centers or decide to throw the idea out altogether. Ask yourself, is the activity interesting to the students? Sometimes students are just bored or they've seen it before. Ask yourself if students have mastered the skill and need to move on. If they've been doing the same activity over and over again and they've mastered it, they need enrichment activities or they need to move on to a new skill. Ask yourself if the center is too difficult to do it independently. And then ask yourself, did you introduce too many centers at once? It's absolutely critical that you do not introduce too many centers at once because then students feel overwhelmed. Imagine when you go to a teacher's conference when there are multiple centers, imagine when you go to a teacher's conference and you learn many strategies that you can use, you feel overwhelmed and you're not sure where to start. The same thing is how students feel with multiple centers. If you have considered all of those factors and there are still behavior problems, then you need to try to consider proximity or ignoring the student. So move close to the student and see if that will help control the issues. Give them the snake eye. That's the one I do a lot frequently, is giving the student the eye, making sure they are aware that I am watching them very closely. Sometimes I will also just ignore the student, depending on what the issue is. You can also give gentle, and I mean gentle, not the image of the GIF there, but give gentle verbal reminders, reminding the student very carefully and using questions when you ask those, when you give those reminders, like what should you be doing right now? You can use pre-correction or timeout. And then when you do decide to give reprimands, tell what behavior was inappropriate and why. Make sure you use a firm voice and that you move close to the student so that it's private from the other students. Some other things to consider is that you should not begin small groups right away. You want to send students to one rotation daily. I know it's quick, you want to instantly jump into small groups, and you definitely want to get started and you want to start meeting with your students one-on-one, especially with all of the pressure that we have these days, but you can't. You have to begin by building their stamina. So send students to one rotation daily, building their stamina, and then moving them into 2 groups, and then eventually moving into 3. You can start slowly by putting them into a rotation for 10 minutes and then moving into 15 minutes and into 20, much like you would do if you have ever done CAFE or Daily 5. While the students are beginning to learn about small groups, you are going to circulate the room, monitoring, assisting, and remodeling to students. It could take up to 6 weeks before the teacher can begin leading small groups. So don't feel pressured to get into groups right away. Don't feel like, okay, it's been 3 weeks and we're still doing this. It's very common to be 6 weeks in. For each center, you want to make sure that you're giving explicit center directions. You want to make sure that you are modeling the use of the center materials during the whole group lesson, so all students have the opportunity to see it. You want to make sure that some activities will need repeated modeling, so you might want to provide guided practice and continuously repeat the modeling until students have gotten it. Provide prompts and feedback, so that way students know if they're on task and doing it correctly. And then provide scaffolding for students to help them complete the activity independently. And then lastly, teaching the groups about organization and keeping yourself organized with groups. You want to model ahead of time on how to keep the materials organized. You want to help take care of the centers. You want to help the students understand how to easily locate the materials, and you want to use the centers productively. You want to keep track of the materials in the group so you can easily replace them when they are needed. And then you want to come up with a system to clean it up quickly and orderly, such as, for an example, having bins without lids so students can just quickly toss stuff into the bins without having to do the extra step of lifting the lid. I know that sounds like it's just a minor thing, but you'll be surprised how students just won't take that extra step. Make sure your bins are labeled and that you have directions hanging in the group on how to clean up and also how to complete the activity. And then I would also put pencils in the groups so that students are capable of completing the activity without having to wander around the room to find a pencil. Sometimes that could be the whole entire center time. And then lastly, establishing accountability. Just like this image here, it is important that accountability is established for center activities, because as soon as students find out their centers, their first thought is, oh, playtime, and they get super excited until they find out that you will be holding them accountable. Once they find out you're holding them accountable, then they realize that they do have to do work, and so they don't get quite as excited. So make sure that you're holding them accountable. It also helps students stay academically engaged. It tells if students can apply what they have been taught. You also want to make sure that you are providing students with feedback in a very timely manner. because you don't want students to be practicing errors. You also want to make sure that you are watching them carefully, and it shows that it's important that what they're doing, and it also instills the importance of the quality work. You want to the process of learning is more important than the product. Keep that in mind when students are working at centers. That's more important, so if they don't actually complete the product, that's fine. It's more important that they're learning something when they're in their centers, or that they're reinforcing what they're learning. And then make sure that they're more accountable for the work completed, even if it's not completely completed. Make sure that you're just grading them on what they were able to complete. And then if you do grade them. And then be aware of any center activity, even if you're not involved. So when you're sitting at your groups with small groups, you are still keeping an eye on centers. So you want to sit in a place where you can see the centers and everything that is happening, even while you're still in your small groups. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to send me a question through the request box or in the Facebook group. And thank you so much.